It is interesting that in the 11th century AD, the historian Kalhana, writing the history of Kashmir, the Raja Tarangani, describes the Kushans as Turushkas, Turks, thereby associating them with Central Asia. Trade opens up the regions, and other aspects of life are also affected. In the early centuries AD, Bactria and Gandhar became focal centers of interchange in religious movements. I would like to draw attention to two connected to India, one more local and the other that swept across Asia. To start with the first, the worship of the goddess was extensive in this area of Central Asia, and the preeminent goddess was Nana. Her status was raised when the Kushan kings became her patrons and linked her to kingship and power. Her icons showed her riding a lion. In India too, goddesses were commonly worshipped, as was Durga. The question, however, is whether the Kushan version of Nana was linked to depicting the power of Durga by making the lion her mount. It is intriguingly said of Durga in some few texts that she is also worshipped by various Mlech clans. The more impressive cultural impact of the Kushans was there being a conduit for the spread of a new form of Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism. This had its genesis in the area held by the Kushans. A number of features new to Buddhism were introduced. The Buddha acquired elements of divinity, and his image began to be worshipped. The icon tended to take on the features of the people who were worshipping it. Bodhisattvas now entered the Buddhist narrative, and these were there to help those seeking nirvana. Buddhist texts were written in the local version of Prakrit, Gandhari Prakrit, and in Sanskrit. Buddhism had always been strengthened by the powerful institution of the monasteries, now accompanying the establishment of Buddhism outside India. Buddhist monks traveled with the traders from India to oasis towns in Central Asia, such as Kucha and Dunhuang, and from there, some continued into China. Mahayana Buddhism reached out to both the pastoral communities and the traders. But by the late first millennium AD, Buddhism was the significant religion in Central Asia, Eastern Asia, and Southeastern Asia. This, incidentally, was also the period when it was being slowly edged out of India, barring in a few places. My third example is of migrants from an altogether different geographical region who came as traders. The cultural change can often be more evident in the new communities that they create rather than in the host society. This often happened along the west coast of India that constantly received migrant traders. Throughout the centuries, the Arabian Sea has connected southern Arabia, the Red Sea, and East Africa with the littoral of Western Asia. Let me say one thing in connection with maritime history and Indian Ocean history that Professor Satish Chandra was so interested in. It was always treated, seas were always treated as areas of distancing. In fact, they're very often areas of people coming together. And this is a very interesting aspect of the past of the world. history of the world. In the period around the Christian era, trade was a source of impressive wealth with investments from Eastern Mediterranean merchants. The Roman Empire declined, but this trade witnessed the growing participation of West Asian traders. Arab presence in places along the west coast is recorded from the 9th century AD. A Rashtrakuta inscription states that the Tajik Arab governor of Sanjan, the area north of Mumbai, was a man named Madhumati, which is a Sanskritized form of Muhammad. He granted a village and some land to a Brahmin in order that the Brahmin maintain a temple dedicated to the goddess Bhagavati Devi. This is a neat interlink of an Arab governor working for the Rashtrakuta kings, making a substantial grant to a Brahmin for maintaining a temple dedicated to a goddess. Another point of interest is that the location, this particular location, was linked to a Parsi Anjuman in Sanjan. Zoroastrian traders had migrated from Persia from about the 8th century onwards and settled in this part of the west coast. They were the ancestors of the present Parsi community. Tradition has it that the migration was of Zoroastrians escaping from having to convert to Islam. But curiously, they chose to settle in Sanjan and in the vicinity of a town with a sizable population of Arab traders. There is no reference to hostility or forced conversion. And one wonders, therefore, that could it have been that the attraction of lucrative trade also brought the Persian migrants? They spoke the local language, Gujarati. And as we all know, that today there is a special kind of Gujarati, which is actually referred to as Parsi Gujarati, which is a bit different from the other. They spoke Gujarati. They were encouraged to adopt the local marriage rules, but this did not include caste. They maintained their own forms of worship, and they were required to abjure violence. This was a case of the migrants retaining their belief systems, but foregoing their language. However, this was not the pattern for all migrant traders on the West Coast. Those that did mix and merge with local communities, including through intermarriage, often assimilated cultural facets from them, and this gave rise to new identities. A number of Arab traders settled in the coastal areas from Kerala to Gujarat, and in their interaction with local communities, gave rise to new communities such as the Mapilas, the Navayats, the Bohras, and the Khojas, and such like. These areas were familiar to the reach of trade across the Arabian Sea. It went back many centuries to maritime trade between coastal India and the states across. The island of Socotra, for example, was a central hub, as was Yemen a little later. The traders, as migrants, were making existing ties stronger by settling in the areas with which they traded. The languages of these migrant communities differed, since the areas where they settled had different languages: Gujarati, Konkani, Malayalam, and so on, each of which the migrants made their own. In the process, the use of Arabic became more marginal. The name Bohra, for instance, comes from the Gujarati word for trade, vyavahara. The communities that emerged acquired differentiated identities that drew on the cultures of existing local communities. But they also had some connections with Yemen and East Africa. Distinctive identities were expressed in distinctive forms of belief and worship that drew both from the religions of their homeland and of the places where they settled. The Boharas and Khojas of Gujarat were recognizably different from, for example, the Mappilas of Kerala, because the local Indian identities differed. Despite the Arab ancestry, their religious identities also differed from the conventional Islamic identity, such as that of the Turks and the Afghans, nor indeed were the Hindu elements in their religion identical with the conventional ones. There is a very moving inscription from Saurashtra, a memorial inscription, in memory of Bohra Muhammad, who died defending Somnath against the attack of a Delhi Sultan. The early Khojas combined beliefs from Vaishnava and Sufi traditions. Somewhat like the Bhakti tradition, they also had poems and hymns that were popularly sung. They were contributing to the exploration of belief systems, or what one might describe as the mixing and matching of religious ideas that has been so characteristic of the history of every religion in India. This changed in modern times when, with the sharper definition of formal religions, those with flexible identities had to choose between the two major ones. I have spoken about aspects of migration in pre-modern times, but I would like to conclude by pointing out that this was a world of long ago, and even the connotation of migration has been changing in our times. The meaning of migration changed in colonial times, and the process was altered out of all recognition. It now involved colonial authority organizing the transportation, mostly involuntary or through capture, of men and women from one part of the world to another distant part, from which they could rarely or never return home. The purpose was to use them as forced labor, as slaves or near slaves, living in impoverished conditions and constantly under the threat of death. Needless to say, these were colored peoples, mainly Asians and Africans. They were visibly different from the white settlers who came largely voluntarily as free men to work and own the land that they settled on, the settler societies. This category had some touch of the migrant of earlier times. The world they were all sent to was newly conquered by Europe, where, after decimating the original inhabitants, the new arrivals, if white, found a future, and if colored, were put to labor. For the latter, migration became a polite word for forced labor. The meaning of the term migrant was infused with colonial connotations. There were some minor migrations within countries from one area to another, but nothing that really changed the cultures of the different societies involved. The change from colony to nation state meant defining national boundaries. These were basic to giving a physical reality to what otherwise has been described by some as imagined communities. The roaming migration of pastoralists became impossible. Earlier trade connections had been broken, with Asia divided up between diverse colonial powers who alone controlled the economy. By the time that ex-colonies became independent nation states, many among them had internalized the identities of race, language, and religion that they had accepted from colonial readings of their past. Hence, the history of the word migration is now seeing another turn of meaning in the context of nation states. It has become a qualifier for exclusion in European and Asian nation states, where exclusion may be defined by a supposed race or by religion, and doubtless by much else. The precisely defined, clear cartographic boundary lines enclosing territory is now a major identifier. It is no longer the rather casual and somewhat fuzzy frontier zones of earlier times. But the contradiction is that history also makes it quite apparent that there have been few, if any, permanent boundary lines in the past. These change constantly. Societies that have experienced centuries of history have had to internalize change at many levels. Civilization in itself is a process by which the porosity of societies, leading inevitably to a cultural mix, is apparent. Societies with an ancient past, such as ours, have in particular to try and understand how those from the other side of the deserts, the mountains, the forests, the seas, and immersed in diverse cultures, were assimilated into our cultures. Similarly, how and why did so many people from our subcontinent travel to distant places in Asia and settle into other societies, creating together with them new cultural identities? It seems to me that what history is telling us is that recognizing the presence of migrants and the cultures that evolve from this presence is part of the process of recognizing and defining who we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Romila. That was an absolutely riveting lecture, as always. I'm sure that the audience that has flocked to hear you today will bear this out in their later reactions as well, which I'm sure the host will share with you. I'm personally very obliged that I could be part of this wonderful experience. I would just like to make a very, very brief comment before I ask you a couple of questions from the ones that have appeared and are still appearing actually in the question and answer box. Uh, I think you summed it up in the middle of your lecture at one point when you said, there is no purity of descent. So the search for pure roots, the search for exclusionary identities is a fruitless search because, as you said, we are hopelessly mixed. And that, in many ways, I think is the sum of the message that I get from your lecture. Of course, towards the end, you spelt it out even more when you came to discussing the more contemporary period and pointed out the limitations and the distortions and the dangers of exclusionary nationalism, which tends to define identities in terms of who are original inhabitants and who are the migrants. Of course, the famous debate on the Aryan migration or Aryan invasion, which is one of the first questions I will ask you, it takes us back to that. So, thank you very much for setting the tone. And I'm sure your audience discovered that you were very uncomfortable outside the BCs when you happily talked about the colonial period and the period right now. But I will leave that to them. Uh, but let me quickly ask you a couple of questions. And in the meantime, while you answer them, I'll take a look at the ones that are suddenly now appearing in large numbers on the screen. But there were two. The first one was, do we call it Aryan migration or Aryan invasion? I'm sure you expected this question. And the second one, if you want to do it all together, is did migrants help later invasions? Is there any evidence of that? Did Muslim traders who came from the 18th century play a role in later Turkish invasions? I will, in the meantime, look at the other questions.
All right. Yeah, this is the stock thing. You know, in the colonial period, the theory was, Mortimer Wheeler, up to the time of Mortimer Wheeler, in fact, the theory was that the Harappa culture fell because of the Aryan invasion. And everybody talked about the Aryan invasion. Now, by about the 50s and 60s, archaeologists all over working on India, and Indian archaeologists as well, overthrew the idea of invasion and said it simply isn't possible. There is no evidence. You can't hear me?
No, we can hear you. We can hear you. Sorry.
Okay. And so we all stopped talking about invasion because we realized that this was something for which there was absolutely no evidence. But when you look at the data, the kind of data that I was suggesting about, you know, the distance between those who compose the hymns and these other people, there was a cultural distance. And then all these references to in the Indo-Iranian texts to Central Asia and migrations and so on. And this geographical movement of going from the Punjab eastwards made us realize that migration was a possibility. And you know that the reason why I'm arguing that it is very important to study migration is because there are characteristic features in the process of migration, which some of us see in the texts, in the Vedic texts. Now, the point is that you have to find an explanation why a particular culture or particular cultures, in this case, exist. And so you have to look at the history of each culture, taking it as far back as you can, in terms of what are the kinds of things that went into the making of the culture. There isn't only one item, there isn't only language, and there isn't only religion. There are multiple issues and concerns. And now, of course, with science moving into archaeology, we chaps are getting pushed right away because the scientists are really the ones that have the evidence and have very clear evidence of even of things changing and why they change and so on. So the issue, of course, is, and the reason why I began with this long prelude of saying it is not, migration is not invasion. The two processes are historically completely different, as I tried to explain. And so if you are going to say that there was an invasion, you have to produce the evidence for it. And there is no evidence for it. Then the alternative is, are they indigenous or was there a migration? Was there some other way in which they trickled in? The theory that they were indigenous is very difficult to hold because there are so many multiple other things going on, and there are groups of Indo-Aryan and Indo-European speakers all around. Where did they come from? They certainly didn't come from India. They came from somewhere. So there were groups of people who were speaking these languages on the peripheries of the Indian subcontinent. And the other thing also, which is very important, is that if you are going to say that no, they are indigenous, how do you define the boundaries of what is indigenous? The boundaries are not the boundaries of British India, for God's sake. We're talking about 4,000 years ago. The boundaries were completely different. I mean, for all we know, there might have been a combination of the Indus, the upper Indus and Gandhar and northeastern Iran, almost forming a very closely knit cultural unit. Now, where are the boundaries of British India in all of this? They're cutting through. So what do you mean when you say indigenous? And then when we talk about all these other groups outside India with similar cultures, we're told, oh yes, they all went from India. There's absolutely no evidence of that. So the point really is that what we have to look for today is what is the argumentation? I mean, instead of just getting up and abusing people, which is very often what happens, what is the evidence for people, this entire culture evolving in an indigenous way? And what is the evidence for suggesting that there were migrants that came from outside, which brought items of culture or, helped in the creation of a new culture? So it's a question that, frankly, many of us are extremely bored with because it's been going on and on for, 70 years now. I mean, in 1969, 1969, when I was president of the Ancient Indian History section, I did a presidential address on this question in which I very clearly started off by saying there was no Aryan invasion. And I talked about migrations. To this day, the people on the side of it was all indigenous keep on saying so-and-so and her theory of the invasion of the Aryans. I mean, how often do you say the same thing, and how often do you write and explain that you don't believe in this thing? And they go on saying the same thing. They simply do not read what people write. This is a very major problem, that we don't read sufficiently widely. I mean, people who today stand up and condemn the genetic evidence, the DNA evidence, very few have taken the trouble to actually read the data, because it's tough. It's not easy. You have to be a geneticist to understand it. But there are plenty of people who write in the newspapers every day about how it's complete nonsense. I mean, it's a crisis also. It's not just an Aryan migration crisis. It's a crisis in education and the understanding of the importance of knowing something about a subject before you stand up and shout.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the solution to that is. Sorry, what was your second question? I forgot in all of this.
Well, the second question was that did migrants help later invasions? Do we have any evidence of that?
Not that we have.
Especially did Muslim traders help later Turkish?
We have the contrary evidence, as I quoted. Muhammad Bohra, for example, who is a Bohra. is fighting in defense of Somnath against the Delhi Sultan. And I'm sure there's a lot of evidence of this kind once you start going into local sources. This is again where Satish's idea of one must go to the local archives is terribly important, because it's only in the local archives that you will really find the evidence for what people were thinking and doing and acting in a local area.
There's one question which I think I would like to bring to your attention, which is somebody says all your examples were from northern India. What about the south? Did
Well,
nothing
I'm sorry.
happen here?
Yeah, I'm perfectly aware of that. My problem is that I have all my life specialized in North Indian history. I think it would be outrageous on my part to hold forth on South Indian history, which I haven't really studied in depth. If I had studied it in depth, I would certainly have brought in examples. And my bringing in examples was not to cover the whole subcontinent, because my goodness, the examples that I should have then brought in were the examples from Eastern India, where the whole question of migration from the 18th century onwards has been an absolutely crucial question. But it's not an area that I know. So I was giving these examples simply to say that these kinds of situations occur in every part of the country. If I'm talking about the West Coast, now the Mappilas, for example, are South India. Why don't people make these kinds of studies and compare them with the people on the eastern coast who also received Arab traders and had cultural formations? And so why don't we have comparative studies of that kind? And I hope that the person who asked this question, if he or she is a historian, will do some comparative studies.
There's another one relating to South India, which I think you might want to look at. How do you look at the Cholas as conquerors or migrants in the context of Java and Indochina?
Well, I would first of all not say the Cholas, because there are multiple groups of various kinds that went to Southeast Asia. You had royal policy, state policy. That's one thing. So you're interested in those who are trading in luxury goods and bringing in wealth. And when that meets with an opposition across the seas, you may send out your navy, or you may send out. That's one kind of thinking. The Cholas certainly didn't conquer any land in Southeast Asia. They were very, as royalty, as royal policy, they were very interested in the trading policy, yes, as indeed were many, many categories of castes, classes, call them what you will, who were also interested in this policy. One would again have to do some work on when the traders go out from Tamil Nadu to these areas, where do they settle? Who do they settle with? Do they integrate or do they ghettoize? This is a very fundamental question, and it's a question that hasn't been asked. I mean, the more recent 19th, early 20th century traders, the Chettinar area and Chettiars, what was their relationship with the people that they traded with? I mean, I don't know. Maybe somebody has worked on it. I simply don't know. So I'm not in a position to expound on it. But if someone hasn't worked on it, I hope that what I said today will lead to someone working on it.
One question on which I'm sure you will have a lot to say is was there a concept of nation in early India?
No, of course there wasn't. I mean, this is a question that keeps coming up. I've had arguments about this, not only here, but with historians in Europe. There are very few who still go on and on about how some of the medieval kingdoms were nations. No, I'm afraid on this issue, I am very much with people who have written on nationalism, like Ben Anderson, Eric Hobsbawm, Ernst Gellner, Smith, all these people who've studied it very carefully. And I am of the firm opinion that nationalism is a historical phase. Like we've had historical phases right through from the year dot. This is a change. And what is a change? It is the demise of what is loosely called feudalism and feudal society, and the coming in of a totally new society where you have political democracy with secularism, where you have the aristocracy giving way to the middle class, and where you have the economy changing to industrialization and capitalism. These are absolute inputs into nationalism. So you didn't have nationalism in the past. It is a 19th century phenomenon. And it comes to us through the route of anti-colonialism, which is very different from nationalism in Europe. And so one has to look at how it comes to a particular society.
Maybe
now you're cheating because you are asking me questions out of the lecture.
Well, this could possibly be then the last question. I don't know the organizers whether they still have time or not, but the Saraswati, the so-called Saraswati Valley excavations, how do they tie up with the debate on the Aryan migration or invasion?
Oh, we're back on that again.
You can never get away from them.
No, I really do think that we should call a moratorium on that and get going with the real historical questions, which are far more fundamental. I mean, to prove that there was a Saraswati River, that there were many Harappan sites on the Saraswati River, is all to try and say that instead of calling it the Indus civilization, we should call it the Saraswati civilization. And why? Because that gives precedence to Aryanism, Vedicism. Saraswati is only associated with the Vedic texts. It's not, we don't know whether the Harappans called it Saraswati, the river, or not. They probably didn't. Anyway, so it's all those issues that come in, which in a sense fog that history. All right, people have had their say. Everybody's had their say. There are multiple publications on this. Please, let's move on. Let's move on to the real historical issues that are much, much more important than whether there was a river Saraswati or not.
Okay. All right. I think probably we have had a substantial number of questions, enough for people to get a flavor not only of Romila delivering a lecture, but Romila at her best, debating, arguing, countering, telling people to read more, come back after you've read, and don't raise irrelevant questions. So I'm sure they've all got a substantial view of your beautiful, wonderful personality, Romila.
I'm afraid this is the many years of teaching.
Yes.
Coming up to the surface.
That's right. So may I now hand over to Akhil Chandra? Akhil?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Mridula. So good evening, everybody. And like all good things, this second annual Professor Satish Chandra Memorial Lecture must also come to an end. And on behalf of Professor Satish Chandra's family, I would like to propose a vote of thanks. Of course, starting off with Professor Romila Thapar, who has given us the most enlightening and engaging lecture on migration in early India. And I think most importantly, how that migration has shaped us and perhaps makes us what we are today. The layers and the discussion dialogue, obviously very, very deep, and a lot for us as an audience and as students and family connected to Professor Chandra. Great material for us to reflect on. For Professor Romila Thapar, for somebody who's most comfortable in the first millennium, I must say that Dr. Romila, you have adapted beautifully. We are on the cusp of the third decade of the third millennium, and you've adapted fantastically to the technology that goes alongside. For the audience, this was Professor Thapar's first Zoom video conference, and I think it was absolutely impeccably done. Of course, a great thank you and a big thank you to Professor Mridula Mukherjee. And of course, Dr. Mukherjee, you remain such a huge support and an anchor for us as a family to connect us with what my father stood for. And thank you very much for your very kind introduction and reminding us, again, as children, we don't always know the meaning and impact of his work, but you very beautifully brought that alive to us again. So thank you very much for that. Of course, organizing an event of this scale, we've had, I think, close to 1,700 registrations. At the peak, we had close to 500 people participating, or over 500 people participating on this event. So, of course, a very, very big thank you to Mr. Ravi Chandran and the Bangalore International Center and the team, who have done an absolutely impeccable job in bringing together this very complex webinar together, which is being simulcast, of course, on Zoom, but also on YouTube. And the support team, Lekha and Raghu, who have worked seamlessly and beautifully to do such an outstanding job. Of course, in thanking everybody, it would be remiss of me not to say a huge thank you to my elder brother, Alok, who has done an outstanding job in, and been the architect of really bringing the Satish Chandra Memorial Lectures, an idea which he proposed 3 years ago, into a reality, and something which really is a fantastic testimony and a wonderful way to remember my father, who stood for all the things today that you, Dr. Mukherjee, spoke about that we are missing him for. And those are a constant reminder of the work that he did and the values that he stood for, brought together beautifully, I think, by tremendous work, single-handedly, by my brother Alok. But a big thank you to him. And of course, last but not the least, it is the audience. We've had a tremendous turnout. We've had, of course, students of history. We've had friends. We've had family. We've had people who've all been very keen to hear, both, of course, Dr. Romila Thapar and also yourself, Dr. Mukherjee, to get together. So a huge thank you to them all. So I really hope that everybody has enjoyed this lecture, and I'm sure that the next lecture will be equally engaging, and that's really something that we all look forward to. So look forward to seeing everybody next year in this event. Thank you very much.
Just a final word, Akhil, if I may, that the inspiration for the lectures came from Professor Syed Shahid Mehdi when we got together at the first anniversary in 1918.
Wow.
So
yes.
Thank you again, everybody, and goodbye and good night.